I got the high chair. Can you hear me? So, Oren, why don't you start with introducing yourself and Primera Capital?
Sure. I've
Actually, do I need this? Yes, you do. I
So I've been with, I guess, with this industry for 20 years. Before actually the industry was born in Israel. First 5 years I was working for multinational IBM as a research staff member. And then I entered this industry as it was born 15 years ago. I started with a partner, one of the first VCs in Israel. And then about 8 years, after about 7 years there, moved here about eight years ago. And I was with a very large private equity and venture capital fund at the time. Now it's just private equity called Apex Partners. In the last couple of years, I founded, co-founded something which is really unique called Primera Capital. We call it, for the lack of a better term, a non-institutional VC because for many aspects we're like a VC, but we invest our own money. And I think, or we believe that makes a big difference in terms of our ability to align ourselves with the companies that we invest in, and also make better decisions, and also worry about making the best returns as opposed to managing our careers. So yeah, with that I'll.
What size of fund?
We invest because it's our own money. We're not even disclosing the specific number, but we are investing up to $10 million per company. We've invested about $20 million in the past couple of years since we started.
So, Sagi, Rubin, I've been based down here in San Francisco last 2.5 years or so. Prior to that, I was actually working out in Israel with a venture capital fund called Gemini, and we did sort of early stage technology investments. So anywhere from sort of 2 entrepreneurs in a PowerPoint slide and just helping them grow. What I'm doing today with Virgin Green Fund is more, you would call it growth equity investing. It's closer to a private equity model where the companies are already in the market and we come post-technology risk and help them. We take on the market and execution risk and really help the companies grow, be it acquisitive or organic growth, and become leaders in their market. So I've sort of seen both, or the whole spectrum of the life cycle of companies, investing in companies. And Virgin Green Fund, as the name implies, we're affiliated with Richard Branson's Virgin Group, where we invest into companies in Europe, in the U.S., and in Israel, but we don't have to invest in any given country, so we'll only do the deal that we think is the best out of all the companies we see. And actually, we've done so far, in this fund, 2 investments out of 10 in Israeli companies, which we thought were good investments.
I think I have a mic. My name is Yoav Leitersdorf. I actually founded my own fund called YL Ventures, which I couldn't find a good name, so I just used my initials. I basically came from an entrepreneurial background. Started programming when I was 7, and I started my first company when I was 16. I'm both American and Israeli, and I kind of lived a mix my whole life in these two, and then also in the last 5 or 6 years, I spent 4 or 5 years in Europe as well, Amsterdam and London, and I was actually in Italy quite often, also on panels and looking for deals and looking into the Italian market. Alessandro was he was in my panel in Milan. So I come at it from an entrepreneur's perspective. I basically learned my lessons as an entrepreneur. I learned about things that go well, and I've also learned about things that don't go so well. I've been fortunate. My tech businesses have all been successfully acquired by public corporations like CMGI or Bertelsmann, which is actually only partially public and mostly private, but basically strategic acquisitions at relatively low valuations. So instead of taking a lot of venture capital money and trying to create the next Cisco or the next Google, billion-plus companies, as an entrepreneur, I've always kind of aimed towards a strategic sale that is under 100 million, even under 50 million, in a fairly short period of time, with very little capital invested. So only private money, you know, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, but not 40 or 50 or 80, which basically meant that we could exit at low valuations and still make a really nice multiple for our investors. Everybody would be happy. So after doing that as an entrepreneur 3 times, I decided, okay, there are not too many funds that have this kind of strategy, if at all. So I started Wild Ventures. So the idea is this capital efficient investing. The idea is also to base the fund on smaller exits. If there are big ones, that's great, but that's not where we're basing our financials on. And we look for deals in Europe and Israel. And oddly enough, I'm based in Silicon Valley because what I do about 70% of my time is I help my portfolio companies meet the right Silicon Valley partners, customers, eventual acquirers. I used to do that from Amsterdam and Tel Aviv, and then I figured, why don't I just flip it and be based here and do it from here. So that's basically what I am and what I do.
Great. So thank you all for joining us. Let's start with a question, you know, as that you are and looking at companies from other parts of the world as well as Israel. You know, what attracted you and what attracts you in the model that I've presented before in terms of investing in Israel? What particular ingredient, what do you think really stands out for you in terms of what helps you to go into a country that is very non-conventional, has a lot of problems geopolitically? Why would you, you know, what attracted there to go and invest? You have Oren, it's the longest.
Yeah, I missed your presentation though, so I don't know what you covered. But honestly, I really go after people. You know, wherever my network is, wherever you know, I know the people, I can trust them. I think they're great people. If they're in Israel, it's great. If they're here, it's great. Overall, I don't think that being in Israel is an advantage. I think that being here is an advantage. But I think that the disadvantage of being a little bit farther away from the market can be overcome if you have a great team and a great deal of focus. And specifically, I'm focused, I have been focused in the past 10 years on consumer-facing internet. And I think specifically in the world of internet, specifically in the last 2 or 3 years, I think more than before, I think that the opportunity to do things and take the whole world from world market from with very little cash and from Israel or Russia or Holland or wherever is absolutely there because really the web has no boundaries. So I guess that's how I look at it. I think specifically in Israel, of course, you know, and I think the parts that I did catch from Shuly's lecture, of course, there's a lot of good things, a lot of infrastructure in Israel. But at the end of the day, it's the experience of the team, people who've worked before for successful companies, seen it happen, know what they're doing. I think there's no, it's people in my mind.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing, so we, you know, at Virgin Green Fund, we invest in across anything that you could call green, energy, water, waste, and anything. It's a very broad sector, but as I mentioned, we don't have to invest in a specific country, and I think that's a very interesting way to think about a business is when you think about your competitive set, or when an investor thinks about the competitive set, you should look at it on a global basis. So it's not, is it Israel, is it Italy, is it from Silicon Valley? At the end of the day, what we think about is where are we going to make the best return on our investment? And Israel, and what drives a business to do that, or what would drive that? It would be great management teams. It would be an interesting business model, strong competitive advantage, and a good approach to the market. And I think in Israel, what we've been able to find is that there's a number of key things that drive that. So first of all, high level of innovation. I think businesses that are built in a very capital efficient way is also very important when you think about an investor putting in money and wanting to get a good return. Something that is interesting to think about in Israel is a multidisciplinary approach to creating companies. As an example, we invested in a company called Green Road, and they do a driving driver monitoring solution. The interesting thing about this company is that their solution is a hardware device combined with the software application in it. It uses a software as a service business model, and it and uses advanced communications technologies. And all of this was created by people that came from the background of industrial design, so more on the art side. And they really put together a team that brings in all those different aspects. So I think that's a very interesting way that people approach things in Israel, and is very beneficial for creating an advantage in the market.
So we clearly have an advantage investing in Israel because we have the networks there, and we know the mentality and the psyche. And it's actually, Israelis are not, they're certainly not American. They're not European either. It's a different mindset, and it's I believe that in order to invest in Israel, I think it's usually harder for foreigners to do that without any help from an Israeli team or from Israeli investors. You really got to get it, and so I think that's a bit of a comparative advantage that we have. So I always recommend for foreign investors to try to work with some local or Israeli investors. What we find in Israel, and what I really like, is and then that combined with capital efficiency, with the ability to build something amazing with very, very little money. That combination is super attractive and is hard to find. And I find it every week in Israel. I don't do a deal every week, but I find it every week. And that is just something fairly addictive that just keeps me looking at that market.
So if you think about 10, 15 years ago, clearly today the ecosystem is so well developed. There is, very established venture community. There's very established multinational community. Silicon Valley is extremely connected. There is the internet. But 10, 15 years ago, to go and invest in a country, in a place that, definitely doesn't have the stability, but some venture funds went ahead and did that. Some investors did that. I mean, Oren, you probably, were there with Apex. So what, was the key ingredient that there was an established venture community in Israel and necessary in a country like Israel for foreign investors to come in?
Yeah, the question was what was necessary for the...
Was it necessary to have an established venture community over there already of funds in Israel that were already, putting their hands in the ground, finding the deals? Was that necessary for a foreign fund at the time?
For an institutional fund.
For an institutional fund.
Yeah. Yes. The first wave started until '93. There was no venture capital industry in Israel. There were actually the first time I even heard the word startup was in 1990. Before that, it was just a small company. The first wave was really, as you mentioned, Shuly, started in '93 as a result of government decision to start a program that was called Yozma. And basically, their idea was very, very simple. They funded 8 funds with $8 million each, so it only cost them $64 million, which they got back, by the way, with interest. And they gave this $8 million to anyone, or to the best 8 teams that could raise $12 million from someone else. And the $8 million was built as a leverage. So the LPs who put the $12 million could buy back the government if it was a successful fund. So the government took the risk, but the upside went to if it was successful, the upside went to the LPs. So there was an incentive, an artificial, if you will, or government incentive to invest in those funds. And based on that, they raised 8 funds, 12 million each. And most of the investors at the time were individuals. It wasn't the pension funds. It wasn't the real where the money is for the venture capital industry. In fact, the first the very first fund who brought in an institutional investor was MIT, was us in early 1995. What happened is that the 1993 funds were very successful because they had great timing. And also there wasn't a lot of competition, and there were a lot of factors and a lot of tailwind that helped them. And based on those funds, in 95, ours was the first, but then in 96, 97, 98, second generation of those funds came, and the first funds were 20 million, 12 from individuals, 8 from the government. The second wave of funds were typically 70, 80, 100 million dollars. And almost all of these funds became successful and actually became, the leading funds even today. So with a very small investment, $64 million, which they got back, because in all these cases, actually, they got back the money. The government was able to really start an industry, which is about $1 billion a year today. Great home run for the government, a very rare one for any government, especially the Israeli government. That's the history. But I guess to your question, the institutional funds, where the big money is, all these, they're conservative, and they don't hurry to go into new markets. And they needed to see the first funds kind of make it before they came in, is the simple answer. And I think they've become even more conservative since then. So even today would be even harder to get them into a new market.
Sagi, what do you see as the most challenging for you as an investor when you invest in a cross-border deal and dealing with Israeli teams in Israel? What's challenging? What gets you crazy? How do you overcome that?
There's so many with Israelis. We shouldn't start it now. But I think, to answer the question, I'd say that, one, I don't think that an investor based in the Valley can make an investment or will make an investment in Israel or in a foreign country on his own. You have to have someone local on the ground that knows the market, the culture, the people, has the network. If you don't have all of those, you're very likely to fail. And most of the funds, the U.S. funds that do invest in Israel, do it in some form. They create the local presence. They either partner with a local fund, so we would maybe co-invest with a local fund. They would set up a local presence with a local partner, or cross that in some way. Obviously, culture is a huge barrier if you don't know and understand the culture. But I think that one thing that in Israel was created, and over the last 10 or 20 years, I think one of the founders in my fund, Ed Malavsky, who was sort of back in the 70s and 80s, and he coined the name a mini multinational, and I think you touched on that in your presentation. What that means is that in Israel, when a company is formed, they don't really have a local market for their products. So from day one, they're a multinational player, and that manifests itself from day one across all the business thinking and across the whole organization from top to bottom. So it's something that's very interesting for a U.S. investor, because a U.S. investor, especially a VC, wants to see a very big company being created, and addressing only the local Israeli market would not be interesting. And I think the challenge that European businesses have many times is the fact that they do have a local market is actually what hinders them in getting that growth, because once you develop a product and you bring the people and the culture is developed to serve a Italian market or a German market or a European market, it's very hard to cross that chasm.
So what's challenging?
Well, I mean, you see, I think many failures that have happened have been sort of a cultural gap.
Yeah.
It's very hard so what happens many times in an Israeli startup is that the initial round is done by an Israeli investor with an Israeli team. It's sort of the R&D stage. They develop the product. The moment the company is ready to go to the market, say it's the U.S. market, a local person comes onto the team and leads those activities. And very quickly, the center of gravity shifts to the U.S. Now, there's always going to be this a lot of communication that has to go back and forth, and a lot of know-how, and you have to find the right people that know how to manage that. And an American CEO that knows how to manage an Israeli R&D team, an Israeli product development team, and I assume an Italian product development team. Israelis in many ways, gladly or not so gladly, are very similar to Italians and very different from Americans. And I think it's challenging for someone who doesn't know the local culture to manage it. So you have to find the right people that can do that.
I want to move a little bit to Silicon Valley because we're clearly building a bridge here. The interest, obviously is to leave and find an opportunity outside of our own countries and continents and grow global companies. And Yoav, you mentioned that you moved here, and most of the time you work trying to develop, the network for your companies. So how important is Silicon Valley really for companies today with the internet, with the ability to Skype and to do everything that you can do? Is it important for entrepreneurs who are in Italy or in Israel or in France to just pack their bags and come and set up their shop here?
Well, I think it depends on what type of business. So I think in consumer internet, there's actually a lot of opportunity to just sit in your garage and do things remotely and get most of what you need through your PC, which is fantastic. But I think as you go more into B2B type businesses or businesses that are based on partnerships, on distribution, then you get more and more into people, and you get more and more into needing to communicate with people, and part of communication is face-to-face, of course. And I think that Silicon Valley is this awesome concentration of relevant businesses, multinationals, companies, people, money, funds, whatever, that startups need or could use in order to propel themselves ahead and grow very quickly. So I love Silicon Valley. I think I use it as best I can. I'm really up and down 280 and 101 all the time, and creating a lot of traction for my companies. And I leverage the face-to-face element. It's also great to be in this time zone when you're sharing the same time zone with all these important people. So I learned how to use it. I don't invest so much in consumer internet, so I feel like I need it. But I think that there are other models as well. So in my situation, it really works well.
I'll just make one comment. I think this is important to keep in mind. Making the shift from being an Israeli-only company or an Italian sort of R&D company in the early stages and shifting the center of gravity to the U.S., if you do that too early, you're very likely to kill your company. In Israel, we've seen it many times, mainly due to the fact that you can be very capital efficient in the Israeli market. You have your core team together, and people work and are aligned and work very fast together. They can get things done in a very low cost and very fast. Once you make the divide, even if half the people are here and half the people are there, you're taking on a lot of new risk, and you have to be very diligent before you do that in thinking about the implications.
Is hiring a big challenge here for foreign companies, finding your talent?
In some cases, yes, it's a challenge. I think what I've seen Israelis do, which I definitely think is something that the Italian community should do, is leverage the network, leverage the Israeli network or the Italian network. And many times, actually, the CEOs that are most successful with Israeli companies are ex-Israeli, former Israelis that have been here for a long time. And it's an interesting thing in sort of the development. When you think about 15, 20 years ago, I think Israel was lacking this management. They had great R&D and great engineers. They didn't have the management. But now we've sort of come to a second and third generation of managers. And, people sitting here that are, go to Stanford and can go back and work with those teams. you actually overcome a lot of those challenges. It's going to be hard for an Israeli startup to hire one of the top guys in GE to come and lead their company. What makes it easier sometimes is having a great fund behind you, a great fund, a top-tier fund. Sequoia is backing you, they'll be able to hire good people. But lacking that, it could be a challenge.
I want to open it now to a couple of questions from the audience. Yes?
What influence do you think the Bird Foundation had?
Can you repeat the question?
She asked what's the influence of the Bird Foundation. Bird Foundation is a binational R&D fund that was established by the U.S. and Israel for joint ventures between companies in Israel and the U.S. So,
I don't know. I don't know that it has a big influence, but it may be my ignorance. I don't know what it hasn't been an impact in only of the 20 companies I've been involved with in the last 20 years or 15 years, but maybe in other companies it has.
Well, let me just give background for those that don't know. So BIRD is the binational Israel and U.S. R&D fund, and Israel actually has similar alliances with the UK and other countries. It started actually in '78. The person I mentioned that coined this mini multinational, Ed, he came to Israel, actually an American. He was the first employee in Tyco, started it up, and the whole idea there is, and it still exists, is to get a U.S. Large corporation, identify a project that this corporation can do with an Israeli company. So, for example, an R&D project, and once that project is identified, the government, the U.S. government actually, and the Israeli government allocate an amount of money as a grant towards that project. I think it actually had a great impact, especially before the venture capital industry. So if you look at most of the companies that came out of Israel in the 80s that grew, I think almost all of them had projects with BIRD. And you know, when you're a small company from Israel, from Italy, and you come to GE or any large multinational, and you tell them, let's do a project together, it's a hard decision for them. When you say, let's do a project together, and most of it you'll get free money to do, it sort of becomes a no-brainer. So I think it's a great way to start developing the relationship, to kickstart it, and then you can move on from there.
I think basically what happened was that the venture capital industry completely outgrew the impact of BIRD by over 100x factor.
Although I think in the new industry that we've seen, you know, with a lot of activity in the clean technology, energy, and water technology, we see that the impact of BIRD projects is very important, because that's where I think the venture community in Israel has not yet completely leveraged. So BIRD is still very important player.
Yeah, and BIRD is an example, but any government grants, funding, you know, the beauty about BIRD, I think, is, okay, and I totally agree, by the way, VC has totally overshadowed BIRD. It's still active, and there's some of our companies actually won projects. It's great for any company. It's sort of $1 million size grant, so it's not huge, but for a small company, that's very significant.
It gets you in the door, though.
Exactly. And so the beauty is not just the capital, it's the relationship you build with a U.S. multinational. And I think if there's a way to build that in Italy, if there is some program like that, that could be enormous.
That would be really enormous, yeah. Yes?
Just a question maybe more tailored to the Italian audience. You know, we have entrepreneurs coming from Italy, coming here, talking to VCs, trying to talk to VCs. And I'm sure the question on people's minds is, what would be the magic formula when I'm talking to a VC that might not have experience investing in Italy?
And you have 1 minute to...
Yeah. One word. Traction. Traction, one word.
What would be the magic formula when you talk to VCs in Silicon Valley?
Yeah.
To get them to invest? Traction,
as opposed to ideas and stories, and that's true for me also. I mean, you come to me with a story, good luck. You show me that you acquired, 100,000 new users yesterday. Let's talk. So I think that you just gotta come already. You just gotta already have early successes to get their attention, and my attention too.
Sorry, go ahead. I just wanted to say that I'm not aware of any investments that a traditional Silicon Valley firm has done in a European company like an Italian company without a local partner. I just don't think that it really happens. I've never heard of it. I don't know if people have examples, but it's just here they always like to partner with a local VC, from what I know. Maybe people have examples though, but.
Can I be a bit controversial here? Yeah. We're all investors, so I'll ask you, why do you need a VC? I mean, I think it's a very important question to ask yourself. And if you can build a company, if you can bootstrap, which I think a lot of people have forgotten about, but if you can reach profitability very quickly and organically grow your business, it's actually a very beautiful way to build your business. And very important to think about that. Once you bring in external money, it brings in a lot of additional issues and considerations.
Let's get one more.
One more. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Bob. It was a good game before, sorry. So I'm Matteo Fubiano. I'm the executive director of VIA. So a big believer in networking. Created a networking association for the Italian community. So you mentioned networking and use that as a lever to enter into more vertical or sector-specific environments. From the outside, the Israeli community, business community, looks very cohesive, looks very sort of closer knit than others. And I think certainly about the Italian one, which we're trying to to bring together. But that's the impression we have. Is that from the inside also the impression that you do have when you compare yourself with, say, the Germans or the British or the English or the Italians?
Yeah, I think.
Repeat the question.
The question was that from the outside, Israeli business community or network here seems very tight, close, cohesive, and the question is if we view it that way from the inside.
Yeah, so I would say, yes, we're very knit. To tell you why that happened, you probably have to go back 2,000 years. But I think it can be created, and you just have to really work at building that network. And I know that an Italian person will, an Italian CEO in a big U.S. multinational, if he gets a call from an organization you're trying to build, he'll come in and he'll want to give back to the country. At the end of the day, we're all very patriotic, so we want to try to give back. We want to try to help. You have to find the right way to build that and create that network.
And what we try to do as an organization that started as a networking organization, really to kind of gather the community, what we're trying to do is to grow our network vertically, so by industry and not necessarily by nationality. So when we reach out to, people investing or doing business in a particular vertical because this is where we feel we can bring value to our members and to companies that are coming from Israel. So.
I need to catch you because I wanted to show you that we're growing as Italians and we're trying to make things on time. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, you guys.